Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dwayne Gill, and welcome to the law enforcement panel on our conference today. I'm going to be your moderator for this panel. We have some distinguished guests on here. My name again is Dwayne Gill, and good afternoon. This panel is focusing on law enforcement only. The reason why I'm here on the panel is that I am a lobbyist with GCSI, which stands for Government Consulting Services Incorporated. One of my clients is the Alliance for Gun Responsibility out of Washington State, as well as In Gun Violence, Michigan. I'm also a former Michigan State Trooper with 29 years of experience as a law enforcement officer. And this issue is very near and dear to my heart. It deals a lot with extreme risk protection orders, as commonly known as ERPO. And today I've got a host of folks here who will help us here in Michigan implement our ERPO laws. So with that being said, again, the purpose of discussion is to provide resources to law enforcement leaders as we begin the long journey of implementing our new gun violence laws. Our law enforcement partners are key to the success of many of our new gun violence laws here in Michigan, whether that is universal background checks, safe storage, extreme risk protection orders, and domestic violence protection. Law enforcement has a critical role to play. Your officers will, in many cases, be the boots on the ground, turning these laws from nice ideas in Lansing into actual real change in people's lives. The success or failure, the cost in lives saved or lost, comes down to how well we can all work together and implement these new proposals. We can talk about implementation. It's not just something that you do next week or then it's finished. We know it's a very long process and it will take some trial and error. We also know that we're not going to have all the answers to your questions and provide a comprehensive training during our 75-minute presentation today. So our purpose is to familiarize you with the resources that you can use in your departments. And many of our speakers today are available as trainers that can come and do an in-depth training in your department, officer to officer. And that is really how we're going to make change here. Department by department, officer by officer, incident by incident. So first up, again, let's talk about extreme risk protection orders. For those who haven't used them before, this is the new kind of order here in Michigan that goes online next month. It allows for a family member, current or former intimate partner, law enforcement officer, or health professional to file a petition with the court saying that someone has become a danger to themselves or others. If the judge agrees, then the individual cannot possess a firearm for 1 year. If the subject of the order disagrees with the ruling, they can appeal. It is not criminal unless the subject of the order refuses to comply. This is a great tool for preventing suicides, mass shootings, and domestic violence homicide. To learn more, I'm going to hand things over to Chris Carita from the Fort Lauderdale Police Department. And Chris, thank you for being here. Can you tell me or tell us a bit more about your work with extreme risk protection orders? Because this is a new tool for us here, and we'd love to learn about how you have been using it there in Florida. Chris?
Yep. Good afternoon. Thanks, Wayne. First of all, I want to thank everyone for being here today. One of the most important steps in reducing gun violence is kind of by breaking down these barriers between law enforcement and public health and those in community intervention and all of our community members. So this event is really a great opportunity to do that. I've been in law enforcement for almost 19 years, first with the NYPD, and then the last 15 have been with Fort Lauderdale Police Department here in Florida. The last 10 years I've been in investigations. About 5 years ago, I was in a robbery burglary suppression unit when I was accepted as a Bahi Fellow at Johns Hopkins, where I was able to earn my Master of Public Health with a focus in violence prevention. At the same time, my community was recovering from the Marjory Stoneman Douglas shooting, and Florida had just passed its first ERPO law. Shortly before starting Hopkins, I was transferred to our threat response unit in Fort Lauderdale. We were responsible for investigating threats of mass violence, extremist violence, in any case that may require an extreme risk protection order. So just as I began investigating these ERPO cases, I was also doing my Hopkins work and learning from the researchers, attorneys, and psychologists who wrote the law. Now, with real-world experience using ERPO to prevent violence in the field, coupled with the training I received at Hopkins, I've been actively engaged with agencies throughout the country, advising on implementation of ERPO policy and practice. I was also honored to contribute to the implementation guidance reports created in partnership by the Center for Gun Violence Solutions at Johns Hopkins and Everytown. I think Spencer may touch on that a little later. So my experience using ERPO has been the most rewarding experience I've had as a police officer. I responded to potential crises, and I finally had the tools to take steps to prevent gun violence before it happens. I remember my first ERPO case, and it was involving a young man who was attempting to buy an AK-47 pistol, and he had stated that he had some people he needed to kill. When I began speaking with his family, and they understood that my intention was to keep a gun out of his hands and not to take him to prison, everything shifted. They were cooperative and got me his therapy records. They told me about previous trauma he had experienced. They knew that I was on their side, trying to keep their son and their community safe. The ERPO in that case prevented another attempted purchase, and it created time and space between that young man and a firearm. We learned in that time that he had been getting robbed on his way home from work every Friday for his paycheck, and he didn't trust the police to help him. He has since re-engaged with therapy. He's back working construction and supporting his family, and he's thriving. Since that case, we've used ERPO to remove firearms in domestic violence cases, threats of mass violence, cases of threatened suicide, and twice for legitimate threats of a school shooting at our high schools in our city. Implementation has looked very different throughout the state, though. Many of the agencies and all three of the sheriff's offices in South Florida have specialized units like Fort Lauderdale that investigate potential ERPO cases and mass violence threats. Hillsborough County near Tampa has been similar, but many other agencies throughout the state have been far less intentional about their use of ERPO and are now catching up. Michigan faces similar challenges in that the law was passed without funding for training or implementation. That means that each law enforcement agency and health system will be responsible for how they implement their ERPO policy. So here are some questions that I want you to ask yourselves as you sort through this as leaders in your organizations. First off, what does my community's gun violence problem look like? Do I have a serious suicide problem? Do I need to dedicate resources to prevent homicide and interpersonal violence? What resources do we have available as an agency? Do I have the personnel to dedicate an actual person or a unit to handle these cases on a specialized basis? Who at my agency will be responsible for deciding when and how ERPO is used? And that last question, I feel like, has been the most important in whether or not agencies are successful in utilizing ERPO. You have a new tool in your tool belt now that can save lives. In places like upstate New York, where schools, law enforcement, and family can all file, often no one does. Something of a bystander effect. The resulting apathy toward ERPO, like in the Tops supermarket shooting in Buffalo, destroys lives. You have to make decisions about how you're going to use this tool. In the Fort Lauderdale Police Department, we have specialized training for the threat response unit. It's a 3-day training that all detectives in the unit go through. It involves behavioral threat assessment, it involves legal guidance, and it involves case studies for previous ERPO cases here in Florida. For our patrol officers, we have a 3-hour training that all of our patrol officers go through during orientation to help them identify the warning behaviors that may indicate violence is coming. And we're working now on rolling out more of a community engagement so that people in our community know that this is a tool that's available, that if they call when their loved one is in crisis and there are firearms, we have tools to make them safe without having to engage the criminal justice system. As we go through the rest of the panel, I'm going to put a couple of put a couple of links in the chat. One is for our Florida courts. So you're going to see links to all the PDFs for our current forms. I know as your agencies go forward, I know the state hasn't given statewide guidance yet. If your own agency is trying to create their own forms and their own way of processing or opposing your state, the laws are modeled off of one another. So it's very similar language. So these may be helpful as a starting point for building your own process. I'm going to put a link to my own website. I've been doing training with other agencies outside of Fort Lauderdale throughout the state of Florida. And I would be happy to speak with any agency who's interested in doing any training in person. And I'm also continuing to work with Spencer and others at Hopkins and to create more guidance for agencies throughout the country. So with that, pass it back to Dwayne and look forward to your questions later on.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was a lot of information, a lot of great information. I'm sure folks here on the webinar will really want to take advantage of it. And just to let everyone know, I do see your questions in the chat. We're going to go through the panel first, and then we'll come back and answer all the questions. So, but Chris, again, thank you for your incredible, important work and sharing your experience with us. If you want to learn more, please contact Chris or the conference organizer, and we can definitely connect you with Chris. One of the other new laws we have here in Michigan prevents anyone convicted of domestic violence or misdemeanor from possessing a firearm for 8 years after the completion of their sentence. This is an important tool for preventing domestic violence homicide. We know that 70 Michigan women and children are murdered by abusers with guns each year. Now in Michigan, we don't have a misdemeanor called domestic violence, but this law applies to those who commit specified crimes against a current or former intimate partner, such as stalking or destruction of property or assault. So this is another tool that we have in the toolbox to stop this cycle of violence. I'm going to bring in Jordan Ferguson from Spokane Police Department Domestic Violence Division into the conversation. Jordan, appreciate you being here. And can you speak to your work on domestic violence and how these different laws can work together to protect our community?
Yes, Dwayne, and thank you very much. When we first started having the conversation about coming out and talking in Michigan, I was really excited because I got to visit my daughter while she was stationed on the Coast Guard icebreaker, the Mackinac, and I said, this is one beautiful state. Granted, it was June and the weather was beautiful, but I'm sure it's very pretty there right now as well. I did try being a police officer for a bit. I finally retired after 37 years. Along the way, I earned my master's from Washington State University, to which I have to throw out a Go Cougs. I spent the last 7 years in the Spokane, Washington Domestic Violence Unit. Washington State seriously started addressing gun violence about 10 years ago. Washington has laws prohibiting DV offenders with firearms, how to address firearm surrenders, extreme risk protection orders, safe storage. We even have the law that gives a person the ability to self-prohibit themselves from having a firearm. First time I saw that, I was a little confused, and I thought about it. If you're going to go on a diet, you don't keep Oreos in the house. So if you think you're a danger with your own firearm, why would you want to keep it, or why would you want to have the ability to go out and get a new one? The new safe storage that you law, I'm going to divert a little bit on this, is so important. I mean, for the last 3 years, there's been over 1 million guns stolen in the United States. And there's some cities like Houston, Texas, are losing 3,000 to 4,000 guns every year out of cars. And the thieves aren't dumb, because they're looking for stickers about the Second Amendment. They're looking for a thin blue line, firearm decals, and vehicles that are parked outside of places where you can't bring a gun, like a bar, a courthouse. And those guns are being sold without background checks and not to law-abiding, responsible gun owners. So I think that is just a great law that Michigan's come up with that. From what I've seen, the new laws in Michigan are good, common sense laws. The laws address people and their behaviors. The biggest concern I'm going to have is that because laws are passed, it doesn't mean everyone will know about them or understand them. Majority of my time in the domestic violence unit was training officers on how to respond to domestic violence, trauma-informed interviewing, our firearms laws, and anybody that's done it knows that training cops is not an easy task. I mean, changing culture in law enforcement is like bending granite. It can be done, but it needs heat, time, and pressure. And just one example, when I started my career in the 80s, I worked with some old veterans that were still convinced that law enforcement was going to crash and burn because of that darn Miranda decision that they'd been dealing with. You know, I've heard agencies talk about, well, we're not going to do those ERPO things because it's too dangerous. Question I have to ask, well, if it's not the police, who's going to do it? I'm pretty sure we're the ones that signed up to do the dangerous things in our society. And if we don't do the extreme risk protection order, who is going to take responsibility when that unstable person kills a spouse, a child, a neighbor, or another cop? And we have probably the best toolbox of any group out there. We are really good at talking to people. We talk people off of bridges. We talk them off of tall buildings. We talk people into surrendering when they know they're going to go to prison for the rest of their life. That is our gift of gab. That's what we were looking for. That's why nowadays, you know, we'd rather hire a used car salesman than a mixed martial art fighter as a cop, because it's about talking to people and connecting with people. And if a person's willing to shoot the person they love, they're not going to hesitate to shoot an officer. DV is still the greatest threat to law enforcement. And every conversation that we have doesn't have to be a confrontation. There's a great article talking about firearm surrenders that came out of North Carolina. It was titled, "Hey buddy, give me your gun." And it's that nice soft approach of, this gun is going to be safer with us than it is in your own house. You're not going to get in trouble. You're not going to hurt anybody. Nobody else is going to steal your gun while we have it. We're going to take care of things for you. The first ERPO that I did was a result of a domestic violence call, and it never would have happened if the patrol officers had not been so amazing. They arrived, they talked with the husband, they made him comfortable. He ends up confessing to them that he was so angry with his wife that he took, in his words, "I took my gun and put it to my head. And the only reason I didn't pull the trigger is I didn't want to disappoint my family." The officer kept him talking. And it didn't take long for that husband to realize how close he was to committing suicide and asked the officers to take his guns for safekeeping. And what this officer didn't know is the other responding officer was talking to the wife. And in that 10-minute conversation, she asked that officer, "Are you taking the guns?" 5 separate times. So it was more than what the husband said. She was terrified of those guns, but we ended up with the guns because the husband realized it was not safe, and the officer did such a great job talking with him. I did the ERPO. It was the first time I've ever applied for an order in my career. That's one of the things I realized at my trainings, that every officer should know how to fill out a protection order. It wasn't an easy thing to do, and I hadn't been assaulted, strangled, or raped the night before. So we know about trauma-informed interviewing and the trauma brain. Yeah, cops need to know how to do an order. We need to get that done. The best time to remove firearms is when the owner wants you to take them. Judge Sean O'Donnell from King County, Washington, has presided over thousands of compliance review hearings, which is the process we have in Washington to make sure people have turned in their guns. And he recently said that most people comply when they get the order to surrender their firearms, to the point of maybe only 10% are having issues in their compliance hearings. So it's talking to the cops, getting the cops to understand it. This is not a gun grab. We're here to help people. We're here to save lives, including police officer lives. And yeah, if anybody needs help talking to people, or crossing those hurdles in those conversations, I'd be happy to help.
Thank you so much, Jordan. And thank you so much for sharing all your work with us. One thing that does come up a lot when we talk about these laws, particularly ERPO, is what you just talked about, is a little bit about relinquishment. That is, How do we actually get the guns out of the hand of the subject of the order, and how do we do that safely? I know you went over a few things, Jordan, which were very helpful in using that gift of gab. But on today's panel, I'm going to bring on Spencer Cantrell. And Spencer, tell us a little bit about yourself and what are the best practices for law enforcement dealing with relinquishment and ERPOs?
Thank you so much, Dwayne, and it's so great to be here with all of you this afternoon. My name is Spencer Cantrell, and I am an attorney by training, but I have been working extensively on ERPO implementation for the past year in particular. I'm a senior advisor for implementation at the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions. Prior to my work at Johns Hopkins, I was an attorney representing victims and survivors of domestic violence in cases and protection orders and crime victims' rights. I also had clients where there was a domestic violence protection order, or a PPO, as I believe you call them in Michigan, concurrent to an ERPO. So I've seen that exist. And I also worked extensively on the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act and getting funding for ERPO implementation, which Congress passed in 2022. I don't believe Michigan's chosen yet to use that funding for ERPO implementation, but that door is not shut. So I'm happy to point you in the right direction if you have any questions about that. But really do want to talk about implementation and relinquishment of firearms. So when I'm done talking, I'll put the link in the chat. But I did work with my colleagues at Everytown and folks here at the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions. Chris Carita helped collaborate on this as well, on a report promising approaches to implementing extreme risk laws. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is from that report. We were able to bring together law enforcement, attorneys, judges, advocates from around the country and have a roundtable and really figure out what's going on around the country to make ERPO successful. And so one of the key areas where we issued recommendations was with relinquishment of firearms. So some of what I'm going to be talking about was also touched on by Chris and Jordan, who I'm so glad are here as resources for all of you as well. So when you're thinking about relinquishment, it's really helpful to have a protocol around specially trained officers. Where possible, like in Fort Lauderdale, where Chris is, if you can have a specialized unit, that's ideal, where you have folks where this is their bread and butter, who are really trained and specialized in this knowledge to remove the firearms. However, I recognize that in more rural jurisdictions, that may be harder to come by. You may not have the personnel resources to do that. Nevertheless, having folks that are specially trained in what Jordan touched on as well, that warm approach. So how can you not go in with the SWAT team with 12 patrol cars, all with their sirens going, right? How can you work to de-escalate things and have that conversation and understand where the respondent might be coming from so that you can work with them to remove the firearms safely? A lot of that means preparing an individualized plan when going out to serve the order and remove the firearms. What do I mean by a plan? I know in my domestic violence work, we were constantly safety planning. Different kind of safety plan here, but very akin to it, right? You're going to look at what are the risk factors that might be present for this respondent, and then what are the protective factors that you might be able to bring in to help make this more successful. So when we're thinking about risk factors, law enforcement on this call are more familiar with these than I would even be, right? But are there dangerous animals present? Are you worried about this individual barricading themselves in and things escalating? Are there other individuals present who might be at risk? So is this person in an apartment building where if things escalated quickly, there are other people that might be hurt as well? So what are those risk factors and what can you do to minimize them? I know that I spoke with an officer, not Jordan, but someone else in Washington, who they wanted the respondent to leave the home when they were serving the ERPO. So they put the order in a pizza box and had the respondent come out on the front porch, so he wasn't in the home when the ERPO was served. That's not the most honest of brokering, right? But you can think creatively about how you're going to do this. And when you're coming up with the safety plan, you also want to think about what are the protective factors in place and what are the support systems that you might be able to bring in to make the service safe and make sure that that individual is having their holistic needs met. So I've spoken with an officer who called in the respondent's mother and spoke with her about what was going on. What are the things that she was concerned about? And these officers, when they're doing this, they might be able to figure out what has there's been an issue, has something happened that's made there be a spike in this homicidality or suicidality. What's going on? Like Chris talked about earlier, the individual being robbed every Friday on their way home from work. What's going on, and how could the law enforcement potentially relate to the officer? So I've spoken with officers who they find out the respondent is a veteran. And so then they bring in an officer who's also a veteran. So they can have that like heart-to-heart relationship-based conversation. So when they're doing the service and talking about the order, it's someone who can really relate. And you can say, like, I know that this is part of the culture. I know you use these firearms. I understand the PTSD, right? You can really relate. And it's all about those relationships. It's also important to gather information so that you're really informed with the safety plan. Looking at the social media, understanding the respondent's state of mind and present circumstances are all going to just be so hugely important when you're serving the ERPO so that you can really de-escalate things. We also think of ERPO as an opportunity for intervention. It's not just about taking away the firearms. It's also about understanding why the individual having firearms right now is a risk to themselves or others. And so thinking about this as an opportunity for intervention, what can we all do, including law enforcement, to make this respondent and their community safe? When we're serving ERPOs and talking about relinquishment, it's also critical to have protocols in place for non-compliance. So thinking about when is a search warrant issued, how can officers work to talk with the respondent and remove the firearms before going that route? I know in Michigan, when the court issues an ERPO, it must also determine whether the respondent must immediately surrender their firearms or whether they have 24 hours to surrender the firearms under Michigan law. And so unless the petitioner is a law enforcement officer or a healthcare provider, there's a presumption that the respondent will have 24 hours to surrender firearms. If that respondent has 24 hours to surrender firearms, then it's also important to think about what are the risks going on, and is there any other safety planning that needs to be done with the petitioner to make sure that nothing's going to happen while that respondent has the firearms for 24 hours. If the court orders immediate surrender in Michigan, it will also issue a search warrant that allows law enforcement to search the locations where the guns are believed to be stored. And so it's really helpful to just understand the nuance of the law and what tools are available to law enforcement when you're working to implement this effectively. Something else that is helpful to think about is, what do you do when the respondent has access to guns owned by other individuals? I gave this example during our presentation on ERPO this morning, but you might have an 18-year-old living at home with his parents and the father has firearms registered to him, right? So what do you do? How do you make sure that the 18-year-old does not in fact have access to those firearms that are owned by a parent? And how do you make sure that those are completely safely stored, most likely off-site, so that that individual can't get access to them? Because it's not just about ownership of the guns, but also the potential to access them. So making sure that you have those protocols in place and identifying multiple storage options for dispossessed weapons. So where can those firearms go? If it's that situation where the 18-year-old and the father has the guns, could those firearms be passed along to someone else, or do they need to be stored with a licensed firearms dealer? So those are just all things that we would want you ought to be thinking about before the issue arises and you're going, oh no, we have this case in front of us. What do we do, right? I think Jordan alluded to trauma brain earlier. That's definitely a real thing, right? So you want to make sure that you're prepared before anything hits the fan. So I will say we're starting to see some really promising co-responder models as well that I did want to raise up here. I know in King County, Washington, the Sheriff's Department has a mental health professional who's embedded in the ERPO unit. And this is also a law enforcement officer, right? But they're able to have that mental health expertise and really bring that to the table when they're working with the respondent and making sure that all of their needs are met, and also able to help law enforcement better understand the respondent that's in front of them, right? And the challenges that individual might be facing. We never want mental health to be seen as a risk factor for ERPO, but we know that sometimes individuals may have mental health challenges, and we want to make sure, like I said earlier, that the ERPO is an opportunity for intervention. And not just punishment. We've also seen some folks working with social workers and their ERPO work in law enforcement agencies, and so those individuals can help with safety planning, evaluation, and monitoring the ERPOs, looking at what happens at the expiration of the order. Has the underlying factors that led to that person to be a risk to themselves or others, have those underlying risk factors resolved themselves? Or are there still ongoing concerns that warrant other interventions? We're thinking about utilizing ERPO. It's just also important to think about whether or not this is the best tool to use in this situation, right? You also have PPOs, like Jordan talked about in Michigan. There are mental health holds. There are different things that can be used to keep an individual and the community safe. These things can happen on their own, or they can happen concurrently. Like I mentioned earlier, I represented a victim of domestic violence in Maryland, where she'd taken out a domestic violence protection order against her husband, but law enforcement also filed for an ERPO, given the fact that the respondent was making threats to himself and the wider community. But they did this in coordination with the victim of domestic violence. We wouldn't want to see law enforcement ever doing something in a non-victim centered way. It's really important to keep the community safe, but not do something that would reveal a victim of domestic violence is safety planning attempts without really working in really close coordination with the victim. So just want to draw your attention to that when you're utilizing ERPO, to really think strategically and work closely with the friends and family members who are also going to be impacted by this. Like I mentioned and Chris mentioned earlier, at Johns Hopkins, we're able to provide ongoing training and technical assistance. I believe I'm going to be out in Michigan later this spring, hopefully meeting and training folks and talking about ERPO and best practices. When I'm working, I always love to bring out subject matter experts like Chris, who have that discipline-specific information and perspective, so that whatever training we're doing is most helpful. But meanwhile, I'm more than happy to help answer any questions, provide any tips or best practices from around the country, or connect you with other experts or ERPO implementers from around the country. So please feel free to reach out. I'll put my email in the chat, and I'm going to go ahead and share this ERPO Promising Practices report in the chat so you all can reference it. But thank you, Dwayne.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Spencer. That was very helpful. I think that a lot of law enforcement officers understand much more concretely how this works. I'm going to shift gears a bit and introduce a local Michigan law enforcement leader, Director Derrick Jackson, who is the Chief of Community Engagement at the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office. Derrick, throughout this conference, we have heard a lot of talk about the concept of community violence intervention, or commonly known as CVI. Your department it was funded statewide for the first time last year, and we believe these programs will keep getting funded and expand. Your department has really been investing and investigating and implementing CVI approaches for the past few years now. Can you tell us a little bit about your story and your experiences with CVI and why this is important to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dwayne, and everyone for being here. Spencer, you mentioned kind of social workers and being co-responders. My background is I'm a social worker who became a police officer. So I'm now the director here at the Sheriff's Office. And I heard Jordan, Chris, and Spencer all mention this word intervention. So a lot of, here in Michigan, we're just learning about ERPO. And so folks are asking all kinds of good questions like we've heard at the conference, but also I think we cannot let it escape that it's also about intervention to prevent violence and save lives. And so a little bit of what I'm going to talk about is just how we've been doing that here at the Sheriff's Office. Even before ERPO goes into effect, some of the things we've been looking at around interpersonal street level violence that I think Chris mentioned, but also around domestic violence and around kind of threat assessment protocols in schools. So one of the things that we recognized here at the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office, we started looking at our homicides and started looking at our shootings, injured and uninjured shootings, just kind of shots fired. And what we quickly realized was a very high percentage of them were retaliatory in nature. There was some nexus to something happened and now someone was injured or hurt or traumatized and they wanted to, seek revenge. Upwards of 80 to 85% of the shootings in our county are retaliatory in nature. And again, we're talking about those who've been hit, homicides, and those who have not been injured at all, just kind of shots fired. And so one of the things we wanted to do here at the Sheriff's Office was really started to think about how we do prevention work. So there are two things that happened specifically for us. Number one, we got heavily involved in something called our local community violence intervention team. I just happen to be the person that facilitates it, but it's not a Sheriff's Office group. It really is a community group. It has individuals who have lost loved ones to gun violence. It's got some political folks on there, elected officials, some local leaders. It's got people who have literally spent time in prison for doing heinous things like taking someone's life. Now they're back out and doing great things in our community. And so it really has a large group of people who are vested interests in preventing death and street level interpersonal violence. So on this one in particular, we were hyper focused on just that. It wasn't about suicide, not that that's not important. It was not that it's not about domestic violence, not that that's not important, but we wanted to stay hyper focused on interpersonal street level violence. So we came up with these 14 things that if we did these 14 things in Washtenaw County, we really believe that we could impact and prevent retaliatory violence and start to save lives. I'll give you just a couple of key pieces. If someone's interested in doing this work, I am more than happy to share. And I'm sure anyone on our team is happy to share. But we did 3 things in particular. You would think that everyone can agree on it's important to save a life. But just as many people were around that table, there are many different ideas on how best to do that. And so the first thing we did was we started learning together to get common language and common understanding. For us, we read the book Bleeding Out by Thomas Abt, right? And so you had all these individuals from around our community who had very different unique experiences to street level violence. But when we started reading the book and we started talking about the data and getting facts, now we had a common understanding. The second thing we did was we elevated community voice. The most important voices in the room weren't mine. They were the mothers who had lost a loved one to violence. They were the people who had pulled the trigger, right? Like those closest to the problem are genuinely closest to the solution. And then the third thing was we just stayed action oriented. We are involved in enough meetings, I think probably everyone on this call, about just talking about issues, but this was literally about saving lives, in particular in our community, young lives. And so we wanted to stay action oriented and always doing something and pushing the needle forward. So we came up with those 14 recommendations, and they were broad enough so that any individual, any organization, any institution like the Sheriff's Office could take those recommendations and make them our own. So we weren't so specific that we were telling people every single detail of what to do, but it was a roadmap for our community. So that was step one, was the community violence intervention team. At the Sheriff's Office, and for our law enforcement brothers and sisters on the call, this is something that we did get the state grant. There were 8 communities around the state that got funding this time around. We're the only law enforcement agency. And I think in part because of the work I'm about to describe. We have a program here called We Live, or Washtenaw Embraces Life is Valuable Every Day. It is a retaliation prevention program. So think about this. Me and Dwayne are beefing. We got an issue. Dwayne shoots at me. I get injured. I'm in the hospital. In Washtenaw County, we got the University of Michigan and Trinity Health, some great health systems. They patch me up physically. But what happens emotionally, mentally, after I get patched up physically and the doctors send me home? I still have the trauma, the fear, the anger, or the rage to do something to Dwayne. And so part of what the We Live program here at the Sheriff's Office is, we have our detectives looking for the suspect to do our due diligence to bring them to justice. But at the same time, we have somebody who's trained and hired to go to the bedside of the survivor and help them to start dealing with that fear, that trauma, and that anger. And what we found is in our first 41 cases, so 41 survivors so far over the last 3 years, is that when people can start dealing with that pain, that trauma, and that anger, they are less likely to pick up that weapon. And so one of the number one things we found, at least in our community, we were working with a group out of Detroit, which is D-Live. So we are modeled after the Detroit Life is Valuable Every Day. And when they came to see us, they said, Derrick, man, the disease of violence in Washtenaw County is deeper even than it is in the city of Detroit. And I was like, what are you talking about? And they said, not that you have more violence, but because you're so geographically small and because you're so familial, meaning there's all these relationships across your community, even if you want to get away from the violence, you can't physically get away. Or even if you decide that you're done with the violence, your family, your community member, your cousins, they're still connected to that violence. So they perpetuate it. And this is why the rate of retaliation for us is ongoing over and over and over. So we had some pretty good success with that. And I'll say again, it is a law enforcement, community-based, hospital-embedded program that allows us to take a unique perspective on how you prevent some of these things from happening in the first place. And I'll come back to some of these, but the third one I just wanted to talk about was we have seen an increase in the number of kind of school safety threats. Someone makes a threat. How do you quantify, like, is it valid? And if it is, what do you do? What's law enforcement's role? What we wound up having was there was a situation where a kid had made a threat. He had a list. He had access to weapons. But the teacher didn't immediately call law enforcement, or the administration didn't immediately call law enforcement. Why? They had such a strong relationship with this kid that in their mind, they couldn't imagine him doing anything violent. And it took them a couple of days. Eventually, we all got connected. And to law enforcement, we were like, wait a minute, whoa. This is like red flags all over the place. So we need a process in Washtenaw County so that our schools understand when they see a threat, here's the assessment protocol you go through. Here's the checklist that you can actually operate under to then make some decisions that all of our schools are now part of. Our administrators are now trained in. Our law enforcement knows that not every single threat is going to come to law enforcement, but when it does come to law enforcement, we know the process that it's gone through, and that means to take it serious. And here's the other part. What happens if the school does their part and identifies law enforcement? Law enforcement doesn't necessarily have anything that is arrestable, or we're talking about kids in some cases, so they're not going to be incarcerated for a long time, and the school does their part and expels the student. Guess what? The student is still in our community. It is still a community issue. So part of our threat assessment protocol, yes, may begin at the school, maybe a checklist to document like how we should maneuver early on, but it also allows us as a community to stay connected when the school is no longer a part of the conversation because the student is no longer physically in the building. And so, Dwayne, I just wanted to mention and reference those three different components, because this is the way that we've been trying to wrap our head around the prevention and intervention space. That I think ERPO and some of these other recent successes in legislation here in Michigan is allowing us to have some authority to do something about. But again, you heard all of us talk about intervention. There are many things we can do to prevent some of these things from happening in the first place. And the ability to actually save lives, I think, is a really, really important component to this work. So I will end by saying this. Spencer alluded to it. We have a team of social workers that are embedded within our crisis negotiation team. They train with CNT. They go out on every SWAT call out, and it has dramatically shifted how we deal with some of those issues kind of at the door of maybe some more violent situations. You don't see us right away going up to the door and kicking it in, right? You have social workers who can get into the medical records, understand the background of that individual, work with SWAT, work with crisis negotiators to give us the skill set and the thought process around how we might peacefully get them out of the location. That's an important shift for us around prevention and the sanctity of all life. And then the final one, Spencer also mentioned, was just the co-response unit. We have a social worker and a police officer who are in a patrol car together. There are a whole laundry list of other things we do on that continuum of services and sanctions. But I think it's really important to have that social worker and that officer in the car together to be able to respond to some of these situations. So we're so new into this in Michigan that we don't have an ARPO unit. We don't even know if we're going to do an ARPO unit here at the sheriff's office. But to hear these kind of intervention pieces, at least for us, hopefully, doesn't mean we can't prevent 100% of this from happening. But I think it does give us an opportunity to hopefully reduce the likelihood that something tragic happens towards an officer or another community member. And I will pause there. Thank you.
Wow, Director, that was amazing. Just to hear the talk about CVI and the work that you've been doing down in Washtenaw County is absolutely admirable. So with that being said, as we go down this path of reducing gun violence in our state, again, what do you all think about the most important next steps we can take? Now, that's a question to all the folks within the webinar, and I do have some questions that I'd like to get to. I'm going to read the question first, and anyone who feels as though they want to take a stab at this, we've got a few here in the chat, and we still have about 30 minutes to go on this call, and I'll be happy to take any more questions. But for right now, thank you everyone on the panel. I mean, it was really amazing. So first question is, what is the typical time frame from initiation / report to court to ERPO served? And are there safety valves, like, for example, false accusations with a former intimate partner? And how do we learn from them? Who would like to take that? Chris, you want to take that for us?
Sure. So when you have in Florida, it's only law enforcement that can be a petitioner for an ERPO, and the process is as fast as we need it to be. So if let's say a particularly dynamic situation, patrol responds out, there are threats of mass shooting, there's access to firearms, they're holding the scene, we respond, and we need an ERPO, and we need it yesterday, right? We can hold the scene, good faith that we're engaging the courts for an ERPO. We can hold the scene like we would for a search warrant. We would complete our petition. We do that in cooperation with our legal unit within the police department, and we could have an ERPO in hand within hours if we need to. So that would be the temporary order, and that could be served on scene same day. Our typical turnaround is 24 hours, but just touching on that for a second, and this touches on some of the things that everyone else has spoken about. About 70 to 80% of our ERPOs in Fort Lauderdale, the subject stipulates. So in other words, we get to the scene, our unit is familiar with what these are and what these aren't. By the time we have explained that we are not there to create a criminal case, we're there to keep them safe, to keep their family safe, and to keep the community safe when they're obviously in crisis, we get cooperation more often than we get confrontation, far more. So 70 to 80% agree to the terms of the order. They go get themselves help. And at the end of a year, we have no reason to believe that the conditions still exist, that they're dangerous, and they receive their firearms back, or they receive their rights back. So we see a lot of cooperation. So very often we're able to recover the firearms on scene, and we will come back with the risk protection order a day or two later. We don't need to rush it because we're getting cooperation from the subject. So that's one thing. And I think there was a second part of that question about safety valves.
Safety valves for false accusations from a former intimate partner.
So just to be clear, ERPOs, like any other court order, are based on sworn affidavits. So if an intimate partner swears out an affidavit and it's found to be certifiably false, the information is a lie, they can be arrested for perjury. And this has occurred. It's not common, just like it hasn't been common with domestic violence orders. It's not common that people would lie because most people are not going to sign a sworn affidavit and risk imprisonment to get someone's guns away for revenge. There are better ways to get back at your boyfriend. Go get a new boyfriend. That's a much better way to get revenge. People don't go, there aren't these people out there who are conniving and figuring out ways to ruin the other person's life. It is so rare that it's not even a statistic. And for law enforcement, you're also swearing out an affidavit. So I'm not going to destroy my career and lie on a sworn affidavit to confiscate someone's firearms for a year. I'm not. It's not even in the realm of possibility. So it's such a rare occurrence that it's not an issue. But if someone were to do it, it's a crime in every state. Perjury is a crime in every state. And it'd be the same in Michigan as it is in Florida.
Go ahead. Do you want to add something to that, Spencer?
In addition to being perjury, the Michigan ERPO statute explicitly says that filing a false ERPO or someone who intentionally and knowingly makes a false statement to the court in an ERPO proceeding, first time it happens would be a misdemeanor crime, and then any subsequent offenses would be a felony. So what Chris says is true, and there is a safety valve written into the ERPO law as well.
That's awesome. Thank you both. Go ahead, Jordan.
Yeah, since Washington enacted the ERPOs back in 2016, so I've been following them across the country. I've seen some really bad ERPO laws in some states, and I've seen some really good ones. But of all the false ones, of the thousands that have been out there, the one that stood out the most was one in Colorado. And a woman claimed that a Colorado State University police officer was her son, filed the ERPO, and it turns out that he had been involved in a shooting with her son 2 years ago. She had suffered a complete mental breakdown on this whole thing. So she did get the ERPO. He complied, which he's supposed to, that's part of his job. They beat the ERPO in a matter of minutes, and then she was charged until they realized she was so mentally ill, she didn't know what she was doing. She actually moved to Florida, sorry, Chris, from Colorado. So there have been cases where they have that statute about filing a false ERPO, and they have been prosecuted. This one just didn't go all the way because of her mental illness.
Got you. That's great. Thank you so much. Here's another question. Do licensed firearm dealers charge for storage, and are there grant funds available to help cover these costs if the storage is not free? May need to look at equal access for storage. Spencer, you want to take that, or whoever thinks they can answer that the best? Go ahead, Chris.
So the way it's very similar in Florida as it is in Michigan. For the firearms to be held by a third party, it has to be agreed upon by the respondent and law enforcement. Now, there was a bit of concern amongst law enforcement. Where are we going to store all of these firearms?
Right.
There hasn't been this flood of 1 million firearms coming into storage, and our normal storage procedures, as we would for any firearm for safekeeping, are still in place. So law enforcement does not charge for it. If you are a very small department and you have nowhere to put firearms, you may need to figure something out to keep them secure, but it has not been the issue that it's made out to be. Now, if the respondent would like their firearms to be turned over to an FFL, typically that's being done because they'd rather just sell them, or they make a private agreement with the licensed dealer as to what's going on with the firearms. So no, there aren't funds available, but law enforcement is responsible to store those firearms free of charge if there isn't a third party that's taking them and that's agreed upon. The same goes for, we've had situations where we have a trusted family member. We've had family members that are former military or law enforcement that are responsible and that are able to take possession of the firearms. It ends up being less of a sticking point because now the person may just be in a heightened state because they don't want the police to have their firearms. We'll try to find a solution if we can, but ultimately the law enforcement agency is responsible to store the firearms and keep them in good condition unless they come to an agreement with the respondent to transfer them somewhere else.
Okay, great. Spencer, do you have anything to add?
Just that we've heard a lot of concerns about the storage issue around the country, and they've not come to fruition in practice. And I know that the Bipartisan Safer Community Act funds can't be used, generally speaking, for storage. I don't know if there would be any other funding available in any other grant programs. It's generally something that's not become an issue, but happy to connect with someone offline and continue the conversation if that's something that is really a need to make sure that we're making sure everyone has the resources that are necessary for success.
Okay. I think a lot of times, especially in my experiences being a law enforcement officer, my fellow troopers their worry is they're going to run across some guy that's got like 50 rifles, 100 pistols, and at our post we've only got so much room for our evidence to be stored. So again, I'm sure that that's the thing that most comes to mind for most police officers. So, but going on to the next question, I got one for you, Derrick. Has the sheriff office shared your program with all the sheriffs in the state of Michigan?
That's a great question. I think, so part of my job is really talking about this stuff all over the place. And so I think we try our best to like get the word out there, but to all the sheriffs in Michigan, no, or just to police in general. I mean, we've had some stuff like at the Vera Institute. They did a case study on our work. We actually hosted the problem-oriented policing conference here in Washtenaw. So we had agencies from all over the country, about 800 officers here in Washtenaw County, not just hearing about us, but hearing about this kind of work. So I think the folks who are, whoever asked that question, I think I seen it was Pam, could use your help, really, honestly, in helping to spread that word. And we are more than willing to come and speak to individuals all across about the work that we do. I will say on the CVI work in particular, it's relatively new. Some of our other street outreach and community work we've talked a lot about, but the community violence intervention work is fairly new. Over the last 3 years, 3 years ago, we did our first kind of intervention case. So we're still ourselves wrapping our head around some of those stories and being able to share. We did host last year the Spring Summit. We had about 400 people from around Washtenaw County that came to the Community Violence Intervention Spring Summit. It was put on by that Community Violence Intervention team. That also allows us to share a lot of this work as well. And I will just say this, I think the biggest proponents of this work, or the folks who can actually talk the best about this work, are the survivors themselves. And so providing a platform for survivors along with law enforcement to be able to say, like, this is how we're actually saving lives, is hugely powerful to do. So yeah, so definitely, Pam, would love some help being able to help get that word out even more.
Okay, great. That's awesome. I have one other question here. In Michigan, if a petitioner isn't a member of law enforcement or the health system, example, intimate partner, would law enforcement still be responsible for serving the ERPO if it is granted? Anyone?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So it goes through the court system, and ultimately it depends on what the policy ends up being for Michigan. But typically whatever law enforcement is assigned to the courts, whether that's the sheriff's office or the local PD, they would have to work out the court would have to work out a policy on how they're served. So it may be that if it's an individual jurisdiction, that the court communicates with that law enforcement agency and they have someone serve it. It may just be something that the sheriff's office in that county does for everyone, but yes. And with that, I would say that it is, if that is the case, if there are law enforcement assigned to the courts that are going to serve orders that are petitioned directly to the court, it is extremely important that they get as much information as possible before serving the order, just like you would for a search warrant or arrest warrant. You don't want to go in blind with half the story. Just like, and Spencer touched on this earlier, having a plan. I'm blessed in that I'm usually first on scene and I'm getting all the information directly while everything is still hot. But if I'm serving an order 2 days after and things have cooled down, I don't want to be the one who stirs it back up. Again, there have been very few situations where it's been contentious here in Broward County, and in Fort Lauderdale in particular. Broward County Sheriff's Office is very well trained at serving these. Our police officers who handle it in our city have been extremely successful in serving these without issue. And I think that's a credit to doing this intentionally and having the same people responsible for this every time.
Great. Chris, real quick, how long have you all been using ERPO?
So Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was in 2018, and the package of laws passed at the end of that year and went into effect in 2019. So for 4.5 years now. Okay,
great. Appreciate it. That's awesome. Someone actually didn't really have a question, but they had a statement. It says here, is firearm storage the next great business idea? So I just putting that out there to the panel. But this has been really great. And we still have about 15 minutes left on the panel for questions. If anyone doesn't have any questions, we'd love to answer them. But I tell you what, before we get ready to go, why don't we do a quick round robin with everyone here, and starting with Jordan. Jordan, what would you like to leave with everyone in regard to this?
Be patient. Things are going to be fluid. Things have progressed in Washington state. When we first had the resistance about removing firearms from domestic violence suspects, the Second Amendment came up mostly from the cops, working on that. And legislature actually came up with a workaround where police could file for an emergency protection order in the middle of the night that would come with an order to surrender firearms. So all of a sudden, the onus wasn't on the officer to take the guns. The officer could justify in their own mind, oh, the judge told me to take the guns, therefore it's okay. So there's little things that'll come up along the way. Somebody will have a great idea. Somebody will say, hey, maybe we should start small businesses for storing firearms or something like that. Little things will pop up. Listen to these ideas, because that's how change happens.
Awesome. Spencer?
So I think my biggest takeaway for folks would be to really also think about coordination. It's really important that you have close coordination between police departments and sheriff's departments, so that information about service of firearms, removal of firearms, failure to surrender firearms is all being shared, but also that you're working and sharing information with the judiciary, reporting it back, reporting it to the prosecuting attorneys, working with social workers, just really making sure that you carve out the time to build those relationships with all of the different system actors that are a key part of this, so that you can have that coordination to make ERPOs successful in your jurisdiction.
Awesome. Chris?
Something that I want to make sure that all my law enforcement partners have in their head out there. I think if you've been working for any decent amount of time as a police officer, you have a call that you went to where it was awful, and you wish you had something you could do to make sure that something worse didn't happen after you left. You now have a tool that can keep you safer the next time you have to respond to that house, or your partners safer when they have to respond next time. You have something you can use to remove firearms from a bad situation temporarily. And there is due process built into this. You have to swear out an affidavit. You have to present evidence to a judge. A judge has to weigh that evidence, and then the respondent gets their day in court and can tell the judge why you're an idiot and why they disagree with you. And the judge gets to weigh all that and make a decision. It's not on you. It's not all on you, but it is on you to make a decision to keep yourself safer and to do something when you can. And you finally have a tool to do it. And being intentional about that is going to dictate whether you're successful.
Thank you. And Derrick, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just say that we're not alone in this. And so it's been great just for me. I've learned a lot, right? Being here in Michigan, I know there's maybe angst isn't the right word, but there's a lot of unknown, right, about what's going to happen. And so to have Jordan, Spencer, and Chris, to have these experts here available to us, to be able to help us put these policies and procedures in place here locally in Michigan, but also to know, as Chris said, they've been dealing with this for 4.5 years, right? The sky isn't falling either. And so I think there's some real solutions out there. And although it may feel new to us here in Michigan, there are places that we can look towards for a little bit of guidance.
Yeah, man, this has been an outstanding panel. I want to first thank everyone here, from Jordan Ferguson to Spencer Cantrell, Derrick Jackson, and Chris Carita. I really appreciate you, and I've definitely learned a lot, and it's going to stick with me. And I plan on making sure that if there's anything that I can do to continue to help move the ball forward and make Michigan a much safer place, I'm going to do that. So with that being said, everyone on the call knows how to get a hold of us. Our emails are all in the information for the conference. I want to thank Gun Violence Michigan again for putting this on, and thank each and every one of you from the bottom of my heart for coming on this. Hopefully we can save a life. So thank you again, and have a great day. Bye-bye.